What's scarier? The possibility that demons might be possessing your house, or the possibility that a real person is lurking in the places you won't go? I live in a small town where most of the people know each other, and nobody feels the need to lock their cars or their house. Our cozy little town is nestled in a clearing surrounded by forest, and we are pretty far off the main highway, and even further from any kind of interstate. Trucks come into town twice a month to stock the town store and fill the little 2-pump gas station, but otherwise, we get very few outsiders coming through. Occasionally, and usually on the way to somewhere else, a car will come through and stop at the motel, which has been owned by the same family for the last 80 plus years, and still looks more or less like it was stuck in the 1950s. We have a butcher who gets all of his goods from a local farmer and actually butchers the meat in-house. There's one little cafe that's barely more than an addition to the owner's house. Then there's the one tiny bar with a dance floor and 3 tables. About 30 people can fit inside the bar, and even then, it's pretty crowded. The only other building worth mentioning in town is the church, which looms over the entire town from its pedestal on top of the hill at the edge of town, just before you get to the neighboring forest. It's a huge building, bigger than any other in town, and it casts a shadow over the entire town during sunset. When the sun hits just right, if you're standing in front of the church looking out over the town, you can see the shadow of the cross on top of the church being cast over the town, its shaft lining up with the main road, and its arms outstretched, lining up perfectly with one of the cross streets. People in our town call it the Holy Minute. When I was a kid, I loved playing in the forest that surrounded our little town. My mother was always nervous and would say things like, "You don't know what or who is out there. Anyone could sneak around and you'd never see them. Then bam, they could kidnap you or worse." I would always laugh and reassure her that I was with friends and we were careful. There was one time when we thought we were being tracked by a person, and we never did see anyone or anything. But we got out fine and never heard those footsteps again. That is until the time we were out during the Holy Minute. I was in high school at that point, and we were out in the woods goofing around and drinking, as stupid kids do. It was a few minutes before the Holy Minute, and one of the girls said that she had heard rumors about devil worshippers living not far away in the forest east of town, and that they would come to the edge of our town during the Holy Minute to do rituals, since from their perspective, the cross was upside down. I laughed at the thought of that, but then it hit the Holy Minute. We heard all these weird noises around us. At first, it just sounded like someone was slowly walking around behind us. Then there were wisps of air and a faint sound of laughter. Not laughter like someone was appreciating a good joke, but laughter like someone was getting ready to do something truly terrible, and they were enjoying the anticipation. At one point, one of the girls yelped and said she saw something go by between 2 trees, but that it was floating. I thought I saw something similar, and commented that perhaps we should leave before we see something we won't be able to unsee. When I had to move back in with my father after the death of my mother, I knew things were going to be rocky, but I had no idea what I was in for. My father was struggling to deal with the loss of his wife, but worse, his health was already failing his not-so-old body. My mother died of cancer, but my father was just in bad shape. He had stopped eating for a while during the last weeks of my mother's hospice care, and the nurse had great concern over my father. She called me, and I immediately dropped everything to go back and help. It wasn't more than 2 months later that I had decided I had no choice but to move back permanently, at least until my father was no longer around. At the rate he was going, it wouldn't be much longer, but I knew he just needed a push to get his life back on track. The guy was only in his early 60s, but he looked like he was at least 80. I had to get him to start eating more, get his appetite back, otherwise he would literally wither away into nothing. After weeks of convincing and talks about therapy, he finally gave in and started eating more and more by the day. I think the threat of therapy was what did it more than anything. Typical old man, refusing professional help for anything. I had been living with my father for about 6 months, and things were on an upswing. He was getting back to a healthy weight, started taking walks every evening to get some muscle back in his legs, and even started meeting once a week with his old friends he hadn't really spent time with since my mother got sick. The guys would come over to say hi every now and then, but it was more of a formality than anything. They understood where my father was at and didn't want to push him. One night, while I was getting ready to go to bed, I heard a strange, dragging noise coming from the den downstairs, below my bedroom. I quietly crept along the hall and down the stairs until I was able to see the den. The den light was on, and I heard some rustling, so I walked down more and saw my father going through a trunk that had been sitting under a table. I walked over, and as I started talking, my father started back and gasped. He had been so focused that he didn't hear me walking from the stairs. I asked what he was doing, and he explained that his friend, Harold, had asked to see some pictures from when my parents went to Russia back in the 1990s, just after the fall of the Soviet Union. He said he was laying in bed and suddenly remembered, so he wanted to get the pictures out before he forgot again. As we were talking, I heard footsteps walking in my bedroom above us. I wanted so badly to go to bed, so I just ignored it and made myself think it was the house settling. It was a pretty old house, so it very well could have been that. The next night, as I was laying in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard footsteps out in the hall. I called for my father, but there was no answer. I rolled over and tried to ignore it again, but then it just got worse. The steps came up to my door and stopped. I called out for my father again, hoping he would answer or come in, but instead, whoever was on the other side started banging loudly on the door. I turned on the lamp next to my bed and looked at the door. It was perfectly still in its frame as the banging continued, loud enough that the door should have been shaking on its hinges. I grabbed my phone and was about to dial 911 when the banging abruptly stopped. Knowing that the front door was unlocked, it could have been anyone standing on the other side of that door. I know with absolute certainty that the footsteps that came up to my door never went away from it. But next thing I knew, my father opened my door and asked why I was calling out. I waved him over to me and whispered that someone was in the house. He shrugged it off and said I was probably just hearing the house settle, but again, asked about the noise. I explained to him that I was in bed the entire time and someone was banging on my door, or at least it sounded that way. He didn't believe me and tried to come up with an explanation. He then joked that maybe the house was possessed by demons. I shouted not to joke about something like that, but he just laughed it off. Feared the worst at that point. Things continued that way, and my relationship with my father was starting to become strained. When I heard a loud bang above my bedroom in the small attic space, I thought for sure that the house was possessed. I would walk out of my bedroom in the morning, and things would be slightly off, moved just a little bit from where they previously were, leaving small trails on the dusty floor. I thought for sure that the house was possessed by demons, especially after my father joked about it. I started hearing voices from places that they shouldn't have been in the house, even during the day. Ever since I was a kid, I avoided both the attic and the basement like the plague, after having one too many weird things happen in those spaces. So when I heard the voices coming from the basement, I decided to call 911 and went outside. I was standing on the back porch on the phone with the dispatcher when my father pulled into the driveway. He laughed and said he was going to go into the basement to prove that I was being crazy. I insisted that he waited for the cops to come, since there were definitely human-sounding voices coming from the basement. He appeased me, sat on the porch with me, until the cop car pulled into the driveway. Officer Hardy had his flashlight in his left hand, and his right hand was resting on his service revolver on his right hip as he descended the stairs. He let out a warning that he was coming down, and had a gun. There was no other way out of the basement, but when he shined his light around, there was nothing. Just the old rumbling furnace, and the workbench in the corner covered in tools. He shouted up the stairs that it was clear, and then came back up. I asked my father if he saw anyone come out of the front door as he was pulling up, but he saw nothing. That's when I decided that it had to be demons. Only demons could make the kind of noises that we were hearing, if they weren't actually humans. After another week of disturbances and fights with my father, I called a spiritual cleanser to come cleanse the house and do a blessing. We even had her go into the basement, as well as the attic, to cover every possible space that could be inhabited. I don't know if it was just the psychological effects of the cleansing, but the house instantly felt lighter. The air was easier to breathe, and the noises stopped. About a week later, while I was getting ready for bed in the hall bathroom, I heard footsteps in the hall. Feeling that it was likely not my father, nor any other human, I opened the door and waited a few seconds before stepping out. I stood there, wearing only my boxers and a t-shirt, as I was face to face with a person in a dark brown hooded cloak. I couldn't see his face in the dimly lit hallway, but it was definitely a living human being lurking in the house. I quickly backed into the bathroom and threw the door closed, locking it. I screamed to my father to lock his door, but I didn't hear any response. The footsteps then went down the stairs and out the front door. I ran out of the bathroom and down the stairs, locking the door and then going to the back door to do the same. I ran back upstairs and opened my father's bedroom door, only to see an empty bed and a little bit of light that was shining in from the hall. I ran downstairs and looked out the front window, seeing a group of figures, all wearing the same dark brown cloak, standing in the street in front of my house. I watched as each one slowly raised their hands above their heads and then dropped them quickly. Then they just walked off toward the east side of town. That was the last time I saw my father. I thought about going into the forest east of town and seeing if I could find the village that the girl from high school had talked about. But part of me knew that even if I found him, he wouldn't be the father I had grown up with. He wouldn't be the father that I saved from the brink of death. Every evening, when the shadow crept over the town, I would think about him and hope that at least he was living the life he wanted to live. Then I would lock all the doors and windows in the house and climb into bed, hoping to never hear those footsteps again.